guess the headlines, I guess you could say, over the past few days. The Houston Chronicle, San Antonio Express came out with a report starting on Sunday. It's a series of 3 articles, last one ending today, that talked about since 1998, around 380 Southern Baptist leaders have engaged in just evil acts of sexual abuse and have left behind more than 700 victims. And so now, after all of these years, the Southern Baptists are left wondering, one, how did this happen underneath our watch? And then 2, what can we do to keep this from happening? So we've got Brent Taylor here. He's a pastor at Church of the Fields here in Carrollton, Texas, which is just right outside of Dallas in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area. And so, Brent, I'm really interested now, understanding that, one, finding this out, there's just such a heaviness and mourning with those who mourn, weeping with those who weep. We don't want to rush past that season, but on the other hand, we do need to figure out how do we, one, identify those individuals, because I mean, just to put the pressure on, you're a man of God. I love you, but you're also been entrusted by God to watch over the flock that God has entrusted to you. And so what are the steps you are taking at Church of the Fields to make sure, one, you can identify these individuals that are within the flock, and then 2, to keep wolves from attacking the sheep that God's entrusted to you?
Well, that is a very important responsibility of all pastors, mm-hmm. and as the under shepherd mm-hmm. of the flock, that is your calling, and that's what you're trusted with. I think that also is not just for the senior pastor role, but mm-hmm. for all ministers on the staff, and I would even say for all deacons and people in places of leadership. I met with our deacons on Sunday afternoon. The article came out Sunday morning. I met with our deacons Sunday afternoon and talked very openly and very, very clearly about our expectations and our policies. It's not something that we want to hide behind. We don't. In fact, with all the people who come to our church who are interested in joining our church, new members, potentially becoming new members, we explain our process for even being able to be working with minors, being around people who are underage, and that involves several steps. There is part of a training they have to go through, and there are many trainings out there. Ministry Safe is probably the one that's the most recognized, one of the most popular training programs that is out there. We put safeguards that are in place. We perform background checks on everyone who is associated working with minors. You cannot work with minors unless you have had a background check. And so that is an expense that the church has to pay, but hey, we don't discuss that one. That is non-negotiable. We've had people who have come to us and told us, well, I had a background check at my last church, and our response is great. You get to have 2 background checks, one there and one here, because we don't back off on that. And we do that we do regular background checks on all of our people who are working with minors. We do regular background checks on anyone who is employed by the church. It's part of our system, part of what we have in place to make sure that children are protected. We have certain safeguards we put in place where it relates to no adult is alone with a child, is left alone with a child. We have very specific rules about the number of people who are in a room, whether it's at Sunday morning or at camp, someplace like that. So we put all these things in place to try to protect.
Yeah, so let's hone in specifically, because I think, I think it's phenomenal what you're doing relative to making sure if they have a past history, you can identify that past history, 1, and then 2, deal with it when you identify it. Now, like what I'm interested in is kind of what you were just talking about, is the idea of how do you keep it from happening, right? Like what are the procedures, what are the policies that are put into place? And I don't mind if we get into specifics here. Like, what are those things that you've got into place where that keeps that from even happening, even if they don't have a past history, right? Because I think that was one of the more interesting things that I found in the article, or in the series of articles in this series that we're seeing, is that there were instances whereby these guys, some of them didn't have this past, but what they started, and a background check wouldn't have caught them because they didn't have, nothing would have come up on a background check. But what happened is they were put into an environment that fostered this, and then in turn it ended up hurting individuals. And so,
yeah, and you have to, I think one of the things that is often missed by church leaders in the process is it's not enough just to look at their past and say, okay, this person has not committed a crime, so therefore we're good and move on. criminals start somewhere. People, people with these sexual perversions, people who are doing these types of acts, it starts somewhere, and that somewhere may be at your place. It may be at your church. And so one of the things that you have to train your leadership on, and that's what programs do, like Ministry Safe and others, is they train your leadership how to spot actions that appear to be out of place, how to spot things where maybe somebody is grooming, maybe one of these volunteers is grooming a child, as they talk about in that arena, certain things that they're doing that you say, that's kind of strange. And I think, we joke about this from a secular point of view, talking about our spider senses tingling, but I think this is more than that. I think it's Holy Spirit, obviously. When the Holy Spirit kind of puts a check in your spirit about somebody, it's worth going the extra mile to find out, to have conversations, and to keep an eye on. Sometimes that's just the way that things are. Some people who volunteer and who serve in a church, I mean, your church, those of you who are listening, your church may be filled with everybody is perfect and normal and behaves the way they should, but if that's the case, yours is very unique, because most are filled with people that are coming from all walks of life and all different backgrounds and all different levels of understanding of what is socially appropriate and what is socially not appropriate. The problem that you have in churches, Nick, is a lot of people, especially in the children's area and even more especially in the preschool area, churches all across the country are fighting to find volunteers. We got to have volunteers. Mom and dad are sitting in the service. People are sitting in the service and nobody wants to volunteer. Nobody wants to go into those rooms. And because of that, sometimes people in those ministries will just about take anybody because they need a helping hand, because they've got kids that are climbing the wall. That is something we have to get beyond, so that we can make sure we have very good people who are in those places and very good systems in place.
That's good. Okay, so help us understand now, because I think one of the things that might be hesitant for some individuals, especially, is when something like this, tragically something like this gets uncovered in your ministry. So what does the protocol look like then? Do they go to you first? Do they go to the police first? Do you even take it to the police? What does that look like for some of the ministry leaders, or for any individuals that are involved in a church that are listening right now?
If there is any hint of abuse, we call the cops.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just, we call the cops. Now, we will look and see what the situation is, but we don't play. We have a zero tolerance policy on that. And if there is anything, we call the police. There's no go through 15 people, and then if all those 15 people agree, then we call the police. No, if there is any hint of abuse of a child, we call the police immediately. And we don't do that because we're noble people. We do that because that's the law.
Yeah.
That's what you have to do. If you expect a child is being abused, you must call the police. There's no debate about it. You do it.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you. It goes back to the less and again, I think this is one of the things that was so shocking to me, is that especially as you read these articles, it seemed as though there were a multitude of people that were involved in these situations, and they had this confirmation bias that, little Johnny couldn't be like this. Oh, I know Paul, he's my neighbor. He could never do something like this. And that confirmation bias kept them from being able to report that. And in turn, not only did it do damage to the church, it did damage to this individual. It harmed this individual in such a way that will forever change. And so one of the things that I was just so struck by and so encouraged by with your comments is the fact that you just got to go to the police. There's just too much that's going on. There's too many biases that could weed this out. And so you got to put it in the hands of professionals, which are the police officers, to be able to do the due diligence necessary to get to the bottom of the matter, right?
And people will say, well, I don't want to hurt the victim more. I'm afraid it's going to expose the victim and it's going to hurt them more. And that you cannot think that way. You're trying to protect the victim. The victim has been hurt. Do not pile on that hurt. Do not make the situation worse.
I was struck. There was and we're coming up on a break right now, and so we're going to have to take this break. But one of the things I was struck by is there was an article in the Atlantic a few months back, and one of the things that it was highlighting, it wasn't in the church, it wasn't a church instance per se, but it was an individual that had been there was an attempt at abuse towards this individual, and it was just heartbreaking to be able to read it, because one of the things that she uttered in kind of some of her remarks during the article. She said that I wanted to be the person that this individual was proud of, but by this attempt at abuse at me, one of the things that this communicated to me was the fact that I would never be the girl. I would never be the girl that someone was proud of. I would always be the girl that was never worth bringing out into the light. And I think that's one of the most significant things that we must do, especially relative to the church, is bring this stuff to the light, because every life is valuable. And when a life is wronged, we need to try to make it right. And one of the things that we might not be able to change the past, but we can bring justice to the past. And the police are a key component in that. We got to take a break, but when we come back, we'll talk about this and a little bit more.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. According to the Fresno Bee, the Fresno City Council is considering adding the national motto, "In God We Trust," to the wall of the council chambers. But at least one local resident opposes the proposal. In the mind of one atheist protester, the delicate balance between church and state is upset entirely by the public display of these 4 words. And despite the fact that the atheist writes, quote, "Atheists like me feel the idea of God has little meaning," unquote, he encourages the local community to oppose a word which he believes has little meaning. One wonders how a word with such little meaning can violate the so-called separation of church and state, but that's another issue. Of course, if folks wanted to purchase the article in the Fresno Bee, they would do so with coins bearing the national motto since 1864. The City Council would be in good company with the United States House of Representatives, which has the motto emblazoned behind the Speaker's dais. And on the way to City Hall, residents may have to drive by police or sheriff's cruisers sporting the national motto. Throughout America's history, the national motto has been honored and celebrated as an expression of what it means to be an American. Any effort to prevent its display should be rejected as bald efforts to rewrite our history and destroy our heritage. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts, joined by Dr. Brent Taylor, pastor at Church of the Fields. We've been talking a little bit about the controversies that has been embroiling the Southern Baptist Convention, that being the pastor, the kind of the Houston Chronicle, San Antonio Express series of articles over the past 4 days, uncovering that there were upwards of 380 Southern Baptist pastors and leaders, church leaders, that were facing allegations of sexual misconduct that left behind more than 700 victims. One of the things I'm so grateful for is that Dr. Brent Taylor was here, pastor at Church of the Fields, giving us a pastoral opinion as to how we can respond to this. And so before we had to come to the break, there was just a clear imperative, Brent, that you all just call the police. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. If there's a hint, You just call the police, let the officials deal with it, and we know it to be true that everything comes to light, and we can believe it to be true that God has put those individuals in those positions to be able to do the necessary work to bring about justice as it's done in heaven. And so trying to think through now, what are some of the words that you would offer to individuals that are listening right now that are maybe hesitant towards the church, that are like, oh my gosh, I knew that we continued to hear about what happened with the Catholic Church, and now it's the Baptist Church, losing faith in the institution, losing faith in the church. What's some words that you would offer to them at this particular moment?
This is the concern, I think, for many people who are people of faith, and certainly people who are Southern Baptist, is not just our reputation, but the fact that we are ambassadors for Christ and we represent Jesus. And so I know many people see these events and see these things, and they think, well, I don't want anything to do with the church. I don't want to be a part of the church. But, in Southern Baptist life, there are, we made a comment earlier about 15 million Southern Baptist people who claim to be, but so let's say 7.5 million people. Yeah. Let's say half that. Yeah. Being maybe conservative there. But so this is what's happened here. These people who are doing these evil things, they do not make up the greater body of the Southern Baptist Convention. Yep. They are people who have done things that are egregious and sinful and evil and should be punished. But at the same time, there are so many things that churches are trying to do, and they're trying to help people in their lives and where they are. And yes, there are institutions that people say, well, I don't want to go to church because it's filled with hypocrites, and articles like this prove that it's filled with hypocrites. And I will tell you this, our church that I pastor is filled with hypocrites. And I'm the chief hypocrite on the payroll there. I mean, I'm a hypocrite. But I can also tell you, too, that there are hypocrites at the fire department. Yeah. But if my house catches on fire, I'm calling the fire department. That's just the culture that we live in, and it's the brokenness and the humanity, the people where they are today. And I just say, don't give up on the church. Don't walk away from the church, but let the good people of the church continue to minister to you. Now, I do want to say one more thing, Nick, and that is that I want to speak to my pastor brethren that are out there, and that is, I just so want to encourage us to call our people to pray about what's happening. And even if you're not Southern Baptist, if you are a Bible-believing, Christ-preaching church, these kinds of things, it hurts all of us. What hurts one hurts all of us. Call your church to pray. Call your church to recognize the reality of the situation. And pastors, I cannot say this enough. Our job so often we feel like is to fix it, that we're supposed to go in and we're supposed to fix the problem. And I think what's happened historically with some of these crimes that have been committed is that pastors find out that somebody on their staff or one of their volunteers, somebody in their church has done this. And as pastor, it's their job to fix it. That I've got to go, I'm going to help this person. I'm going to show them that pathway to healing. And so they avoid calling the authorities, getting the authorities involved, because they're going to take care of it, don't want to risk a lawsuit, those types of things. Don't let that thinking be your thinking. Yeah. Reach out to the people who can respond and deal with the criminal side of things, but while you continue to be the pastor and and have your pastoral voice speaking into the situation as well. There's a place for both. Yeah. I think there's a point, and again, I hate that we have to do this, and I have to make it in. I'll just try to make it in 2 sentences, so I don't try to deflect. One, this is wrong. This is so wrong. But don't let this become the reason why you don't get to get back to church. Don't let this be the reason why to be turned away from the church. Right. One of the things that again, I hate to even mention it because I feel like I'm belittling the situation when you pivot from it so quickly. And there's a sense that you just want to own the gravity of it. And I guess it's within my own sense that I'm just uncomfortable in the midst. And I should be uncomfortable. The uncomfortability is a reminder of this broken world and how we weren't made for this broken world, that we're just trying to navigate our way through it. And so I want to sit in this, but also want to recognize that even in the midst of this, that we can find God's hand redeeming and working in the midst of this, right? Yes, and you bring up, I think it's such a great point, Nick, that you bring up that in our American culture today, our American culture is identify the problem, fix it as quickly as possible, and try to move on.
Yeah.
And we see that in politics. We see that in, the celebrities. We see it with the athletes. And so, if you get caught in some kind of scandal, then what you do is you publicly apologize. You go to the retreat center, the celebrity retreat center, and then you come back later and look, when you look at the Bible talks about, you see, especially in the Old Testament, you see people grieving, you see people mourning, you see the sackcloth and ashes, so to speak. Yeah. There is a place to stop and repent and to grieve and to mourn what has happened. Yes, there is a time to say we've got to now move forward, we've got to change things, we've got to fix things. But that should, I think, only come after individuals have taken their own personal time to grieve over the situation, to mourn the situation. Is there a set amount of time? I can't say that there is a set amount of time that you must do that. We should be stopping the pain, stopping the hurt as quickly as possible, but we should also not rush the grieving process. Yeah. And the mourning process, because that's an important part of recognizing the gravity and the depth of the hurt and the pain and suffering that these victims have gone through.
And I'm thinking to myself, if we rush past this too quickly, we will fail to learn everything that brought us to this particular point. I think there's an aspect of the grieving process of just the feeling and the weight of the uncomfortableness of the wrong that allows us to see with clarity, because it often calls us back to look at the past, right? That we there's the Kierkegaard quote that we live moving forward, but we understand looking backward. And by looking backwards, we're able to see what are those signs I should have seen? What are those loopholes in the policies? What were those things that happened that allowed this to be able to foster and then to be able to create this evil? And so when we so quickly try to rush and fix things, it keeps us from really understanding the weightiness of the problem and wholly fixing the problem as well. And so again, we do need to come up with solutions. We do need to make sure that this doesn't happen again, but there must be a time for us to sit in the weight of this and understand the vastness of it so that we might not be able to perpetuate it into the future.
Well, Isaiah chapter 1, wash and make yourselves clean, take your evil deeds out of my sight, stop doing wrong, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed. All those things that we see in Isaiah chapter 1, there is a place to do all of those things. Yeah. And we need that because our culture is, hey, let's just tidy this thing up and move on so we can kind of be done with it and forget about it. I don't know if the Houston Chronicle or any of these other newspapers are going to do any more articles, but I do know that the church and the Southern Baptist Convention, which I'm a part of, has got to take time to look, to repent, to turn, even though it wasn't necessarily us, it was our organization that we were a part of, and to say things have got to change. Yep. So we repent. And then out of that repentance, we let the Lord speak into our lives. Yeah. We don't come up with the plans. We let the Lord lead us to healing.
That's good. Well, we've got to take a break. When we come back from the break, we're going to transition topics. There was a fascinating study that indicated that almost 50% of Christian millennials believe it's judgmental for them to witness. And so we'll talk about that and more right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. So grateful that you decided to join us today on this Wednesday, February 13, 2019 day. During the first hour, we talked a little bit about what was happening within Southern Baptist life, specifically some of the series of articles that came out of the Houston Chronicle and San Antonio Express, their joint investigation on just the sexual abuse that's run rampant within the Southern Baptist Convention over the past 10 plus years, leaving behind 700 victims. We talked about some of the implications from that and just some of the findings in it as well. And we're joined in studio by Dr. Brent Taylor, pastor in Carrollton, Texas at Church at the Fields, and so grateful that he's decided to join us. But here during the second hour, we've got some great articles that I'm really looking forward to talking about, specifically about some of this kind of the Great Commission not necessarily being great among millennials right now that I'm really interested to dig down into, as well as some other articles that we'll be talking about. Specifically, Senator Ben Sass out of Nebraska has an article on an op-ed on infanticide that we'll be talking a little bit about. But we also have a new guest that's joining us over the phone right now. We've got Michael McAfee that's joining us. Michael, how are you, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
So grateful that you've decided to join us. Michael is the director of Bible engagement for the Museum at the Bible. Michael is he's no newbie to Point of View. He's joined us a couple of times. Always so grateful that he's here. And then Brent, you're stuck with me again for this hour in studio, though. So
I view it. I'm stuck with Michael this hour.
Well, I won't let that kind of hinder my spirits, to say the least, and especially trying to evangelize you on the glories of pork barbecue. But let's go ahead and jump into it, shall we? So I want to talk a little bit about this article that was published out of Christianity Today. Half of millennial Christians say it's wrong to evangelize. According to a recent study, nearly 47% of practicing Christian millennials, and I think that's a really important part that I want to emphasize right now, practicing Christian millennials, churchgoers who consider religion an important part of their lives, believe that evangelism is wrong. This was done out of Barna, and David Kinnaman points out to the rising cultural expectation against judging personal choices. And so specifically among practicing Christian millennials, they were twice as likely as Gen X and 4 times as likely as boomers and elders to agree with the statement, if someone disagrees with you, it means they're judging you. Michael, this is fascinating right now, and as someone that is in tune with the biblical narrative, especially from a vocational standpoint, from a pastoral standpoint, as a teaching pastor, now how does this news fall on you? What's your reaction to this?
Yeah, I think it shows that my generation, speaking as a millennial, we have been catechized not as much by the church, but we've allowed sort of our colleges or secular culture to shape the way that we think about evangelism. And I remember going back to my college days, taking a class on evangelism where there was a plurality of faiths. And when the topic of evangelism got brought up, it was the first time that I encountered this negative perception and understanding that evangelism is wrong, that it is judgmental. And to me, it shows that others in my generation, our generation, haven't grasped the exclusivity claims that Christ makes in the scriptures, and it's easy to kind of allow the narrative of live and let live, and there being multiple ways to God or to spiritual fulfillment or whatever. And so if that were true, then it would be right that we shouldn't be so narrow and judgmental. However, if you start with a biblical foundation, a biblical view of life, then evangelism is the most loving thing that you can do for anyone, is to share with them the hope that is in Christ.
Yeah, I was reminded of kind of the Taylor Swift lyric, haters gonna hate, right? And like, we live in a you do you kind of world, and in this such a world, personal preferences are imprisoned to collective ideals. And so, Brent, when you hear news like this, does this strike you as, one, obviously it's unbiblical, the idea that it's wrong, but what are some of the influences that you think that bring us to such a large number? Because again, it's not just, these aren't Americans that think it's wrong. These aren't church-going. These are church-going Christian, self-identified Christian millennials that are saying that this is, almost half of them are saying it's wrong. What are you to make of this? What brought us to this particular point?
Well, it's no secret that I'm not a millennial, and so
unfortunately not. But you do have the beard, though.
Yes,
you do have the beard.
Yes, and I do drink coffee. But as far as what's happened, I think with millennials, I think part of the issue is when I was growing up, we went to church all the time. Mm-hmm. And when I say all the time, a lot of the listeners will remember going to church all the time: Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and that was just the baseline for being considered in the kingdom of God. The rest of the times you were there, Friday morning, Friday night, Saturday, all these different events that were going on. But now it's gotten to where people go to church only on Sunday morning. And because people, and this has been going on for quite some time, but because people have made that choice and churches have kind of built their schedules around that, they're not getting the training and the teaching of the importance of evangelism like many of us grew up with. It's not talked about as much. It's not showing up in as many sermons, and so people are not. Many of the millennials were not raised hearing it like a lot of other generations heard it over and over again. So I think that's an issue that's an internal issue within the life of the church that we're seeing some of the fallout from. Obviously, there's this fear in our culture is if I say anything, then I'm going to be viewed as being judgmental. These types of issues that we've raised. But I think there's some internal issues that we have to examine as well as to how the church operates today.
Yeah. So, Michael, how do you respond to the millennial that would fall into this category of just saying, yeah, I don't want to be seen as judgmental. Like my friends have various beliefs. I grew up in a very diverse community, and I don't hang out with a lot of Christians. And isn't that what Jesus said? Like, in order to fish for men, you got to get wet. And so these individuals are getting wet right now, but they also don't want to be considered judgmental. So how do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I want to affirm them and understand that they're wanting to, what I think they want is to be understood as loving people that they're wanting to evangelize. And so I want to affirm them in that we, depending on your tradition or where you're from, like we don't want to come off just guns blazing, turn or burn or, whatever, but that we do want to understand that if the Christian narrative is true, if the biblical narrative does define true reality and someone is living contrary to that reality, then it's unloving for us. It's not loving to our friends or family members that don't believe the gospel, to keep that from them or to not share with them the hope that is in Christ and share with them that they're living out a lie right now. It's actually very selfish. It's very unloving to not share that with them because it means that we would rather have their love and affection in addition to the love and affection of Christ. And so rather than saying something that would potentially hurt our status with them or hurt our friendship with them, we would rather keep our relationship intact and their love for us strong. And it's self-centered rather than being selfless. Only true friends tell you when you're doing something that's wrong, something that's hurtful. But that's saved my life before, and it's, helped others. And so we want to be that type of true friend that tells the truth that we have, the hope that we have in Christ in a way that's loving and grace-filled in the same way that we received it.
Yeah. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. We'd love to hear from you. What do you think of this study? 47% of millennial Christians think it's wrong to share the good news. We'll take a break, but we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Nicholas Phillips recently wrote about what he called the sham of American centrism. He tried to explain why former Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz would fail as a presidential candidate. While doing that, he cites a report from the voter study group that helps explain the 2016 presidential election and may even predict the 2020 election. The study plotted a public opinion survey of 2016 electorate along an XY graph. The x-axis represents economic views, the y-axis represents social views. Voters who are social conservatives and economic conservatives are in the upper right-hand quadrant. Voters who are liberal on both social and economic issues are in the lower left quadrant. Howard Schultz, who is a social liberal but a fiscal conservative, would be in the lower right quadrant, where a mere 3.8% of the electorate can be found. Those who voted for Donald Trump were in both the upper left and upper right quadrants. He appealed to both traditional conservatives and populists. By contrast, those who voted for Hillary Clinton cluster mostly in the lower left quadrant. These voters were very liberal both on social issues and economic issues. And I think this illustrates why so many of the announced Democratic presidential candidates are promoting very liberal ideas. Those who voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 are uniformly liberal on social and economic issues, often to the extreme. They will be the ones who will select the next Democratic presidential candidates in 2020. This voter study group graph might actually become quite useful in predicting both the Democratic presidential nominee and even the eventual winner of the 2020 presidential election. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From roadside attractions, Run the Race. Two brothers share an unbreakable bond, but life's unexpected adversities put their future in question. Run the Race, rated PG, in theaters February 22nd.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts, joined in studio by Dr. Brent Taylor, pastor at Church of the Fields. And then we've also got over the phone Michael McAfee, who is the director of Bible engagement for the Museum of the Bible and is also a teaching pastor at Council Road up in Oklahoma. And so grateful that Michael's joining us over the phone. We've been specifically talking about this idea that the Great Commission according to church-going Christian millennials, isn't necessarily so great. That there was a study that was put out that indicated that 47% of practicing Christian millennial churchgoers who consider religion an important part of their lives believe that evangelism is wrong. And Michael, one of the things that I think was I don't know, is worthy of consideration right now is just the individualistic nature, especially among millennials. And so a couple of other studies that came out around this time is there was a Gallup poll that was put out that said 44% of millennials said that they don't go to church because they prefer to worship on their own. 33% cited their distaste for organized religion. There's this customizable, very individualistic mentality that seems to be at least a part, I don't want to say it characterizes, at least to be a part of the profile of the millennial. But that, especially when you think about the biblical narrative and you think about the Christian life, about how no man is an island, about the idea of not forsaking the gathering together, it's very detrimental, I would argue, for millennials to kind of take this individualistic mindset when you think about it. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. This is a passion and a burden that I have for my generation, that on Sunday, I'm at my local church teaching on group multiplication, and we're talking about this very issue, that there's a lot of millennials that are coming sort of to our church for groups, or another church for the service, and another church for worship nights, and just kind of this buffet style of, well, I'll take a little from each so I get the best of all the worlds. And it's very me-centric, and it's ironic because millennials are so cause-oriented, but we're cause-oriented in communities, right? And so one thing that I hope is that churches will be open and help to mobilize millennials as a community, to call them to lay down their preferences, to lay aside sort of that me-centered mentality, and to commit to a church, even though FOMO just kind of captures them, and they don't want to miss out on something great at another church, but to say, I'm going to belong to these people. And that was the charge I gave to my fellow millennials is, hey, we don't have I'm one of the teaching pastors. We don't have the best teaching at this church. We don't have the best worship. We don't have the best groups or the best whatever. But what we got is a group of broken people that's wanting to follow Jesus and serve this city. And so that should be enough. I mean, that's my hope, is that that's enough, because that's what Jesus did. And to kind of just call out that self-centeredness in millennials and invite them to commit themselves to something, because that's when you begin to see something beautiful flourish, is when you've committed to one thing and kind of dismissed that you're not going to date the church anymore, but you're going to marry it.
Michael, I want to ask you about that, because I think that's a real problem that churches are having today. How in our culture, where not just with millennials, but really across the board, we have created very much an environment where you design everything for your life. You know, you're the curator of your life, and you decide how you want everything, and whether it's exactly how your burrito is built at Chipotle or what videos you choose to watch with Netflix. How do you deal with that when it comes to the church and trying to help all generations to understand the importance of the body and the body being together? What tips could you give to pastors who are listening, who are dealing with these types of issues back in their congregations as well?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I'd love, obviously, to hear your response. Mine is, number one, kind of what I just said, calling that out in millennials or in just churchgoers, that it is so easy to look at, hey, we want to orient church to serve your needs, and instead rather to kind of help flip that on its head and say, hey, you're coming and you're here to serve the needs of this city, not necessarily to serve just our church, yes, but our church is mobilized together to serve this community. And I think making helping them to see that the mission of the church to reach a community is what's crucial in that. And I think that same kind of flipping on its head also seeps into why millennials have this view of evangelism, is that if church, for decades, they've grown up with youth groups with all the best production and like the retreats and everything was kind of about them. And even in our teaching, myself included, like it's so easy for me to orient teaching around how is this going to appeal or how is this going to speak to millennials or just churchgoers right where they're at. And so I want to make sure that their needs are being met. As a result, we're maximizing sort of God's love and grace towards them beyond a point that we don't want them to know that he also has judgment. And so then it obviously, it should be no surprise to us that then this generation, we grow up and say, well, yeah, that would be judgmental to say to someone that that they should believe like I do, because as far as we know, the reason why God exists is to love us and give us grace, and he thinks we're the most awesome thing he's ever created. And so then the judgment piece of God and the need for the cross to run to because of our sinfulness doesn't make sense to us. So I think that as churches preach the gospel, as they call people to repentance and faith, and then see the church body mobilized to serve and reach a city on mission, I think it kind of maybe does both of those things. What have you seen?
Yeah, like I'd be interested, Brent. Like, what is it that's working with you and your church specifically?
Well, I don't know that. I think it's a conundrum. I'd love to sit here and tell you, well, here, these are the things that we are doing that are helping. That are solving the problem. I think we're experiencing a level of frustration because at a time when we need people moving toward the church. People are backing away, becoming spectators. And it's interesting because we've even made it to where if you now you can stay at home. I had one of my church members say to me the other day, man, Sunday was awesome. And I said, well, thanks. They go, yeah, we had pajama church. And I said, well, what is pajama church? And they said, well, we stayed home and we watched you online.
It's the non-denominational bedside
right.
Baptist.
I guess, yes. So it's the bedside Baptist for the video generation that you can still consider yourself part of the church because you watch it. And yet trying to help people to understand that the body is to come together. It's not supposed to be this is not the flavor of the month and decide whether or not you want to participate. And so I think that's a frustration that a lot of people feel. I know it gets pegged on millennials. I know a lot of times it gets put on millennials, and obviously this is the Millennial Roundtable, but I think that it's a generation-wide kind of thing. We have people who are older who can't come for health reasons. That's one thing. But I think there's a lot of folks in those other generations that are
don't take this away from us. This is the Millennial Round. We only talk about millennials here, even the problems. It's all our problem, okay? So don't try to share this. Okay, so here's one of the things I'm always captivated
I'll pat you
about.
on the head in a moment.
And here's what happens. So I think we just naturally share what we love, right? Like you get to a conversation with me for about 5 minutes, you're going to find out pretty quickly what I love because I'm going to gravitate towards that particular end. Brent, when I'm talking with you, it's going to naturally come up, your brokenness of liking beef barbecue brisket. And naturally, I'm going to talk about what I love, which is pulled pork, which is a reminder of God's goodness and grace on this very broken world. Okay? And so, I think we just naturally are going to gravitate towards that which we love. And so I always wonder, do we have an attendance problem? Do we have a lack of being able to talk and share the gospel? Or do we have a love issue, right? The heart of this. I still vividly remember when I was just beginning walking with Jesus when I was a freshman in college. I heard a phrase that said that we don't necessarily we don't have an attendance issue. We have a heart issue. We make time for that which we love. And I think we're just seeing that we have millennials that are there's a lot of things that are competing for our love right now. There's a lot of things that are competing for our love in this very entertainment-driven Netflix age. And what we're finding is that a lot of people that were once going to church because there wasn't as many options available on Sunday because of blue laws and technology, et cetera, now aren't being forced to feel the need to be able to go. Response?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think you have a lot of problems. So that goes without saying. But I do think it's a hard issue because if you go back to the book of Revelation where Jesus talks about leaving your first love, I think that very much is what's happening and what's taking place. But again, it's the heart is an issue. The love of the heart is an issue. But the mind is also an issue because the mind says, I am the consumer. Yep. I am the one that gets to choose what I want and what I don't want. And that bleeds over into this issue of evangelism and whether or not we're going to share our faith because I don't know if that for me is the right thing to do, despite what Jesus tells us, what is so clear in the Gospels. And so this drive towards self, this selfishness, as Michael mentioned, I think is a very, very serious issue, a very real problem.
Okay, and we've got to go to a break, but when we come back, we're going to continue talking about this and a little bit more, but we'll have Michael with us as well as Brent's going to stay around, and so we'll be back right after this.
Question, do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by non-millennial Brent Taylor,
Good to be here.
Pastor, Church of the Fields. And then we're also joined over the phone. We've got Michael McAfee, who is the Director of Bible Engagement for the Museum of the Bible, also a teaching pastor at Council Road Baptist Church up in Oklahoma. Been talking a little bit about millennials understanding of the Great Commission, feeling like a sense of wrong, not wanting to be judgmental. And Michael, I think that's one of the, before we were talking about the break, I think that was one of the things that just kind of shocks me. One, the idea, not wanting to be judged. Two, they're already, like, we all judge each other. We have a more palatable term for it. We just call it first impressions. And so we're all judging each other. It's do you let somebody outside that first judgment box, which I think could be either the beneficial thing or the detrimental thing to moving forward in it. And so this sense of, like, when you're not sharing what you naturally, I think you do share what you naturally love. So it always raises the question for me, do we just have a group of millennials that are around Jesus but not necessarily following after Jesus? And I hate to be so judgmental, and ironically, I hate to be so judgmental in that, but I just think, like, you just naturally share what you love. And so I just wonder, are millennials, are they just not, do they just not know? Do they not love? Like, what? Like, I'm trying to think of a better rationale to it.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things here. The number one, kind of looking at trying to break down what's going on in their mind. I think the judgment accusation that comes is often because we are claiming that we have absolute knowledge of truth to someone that doesn't believe like we do, and so that seems judgmental because all of a sudden you're talking to someone saying, I know something that you don't, and you're not just we can agree to disagree, you're wrong in what you believe. And then if the accusation does come that we're being judgmental, they're making the exact same claim.
Oh, yeah.
They know that we're wrong. And so I think that, number one, it's a mistake by millennial Christians to not understand that. And then secondly, the question of love, which was such a good discussion before break that you brought up, was that I think there's two parts of that. Number one, that you can expand this beyond millennials, that many practicing Christians today don't have a full understanding of the gospel and the love that cost Jesus his life because he stood in front of the judgment of God. So I do think that there's something of embracing more fully and understanding more fully the gospel. I mean, according to a past Barna study, 50% of those who profess to be Christians don't believe that Jesus lived a sinless life. Mm-hmm. So even just right there, you see a misunderstanding of who Jesus is and what he's accomplished for us. And then the second part of that love is, I do think, going back to the idea of millennials connecting to the church, my encouragement to pastors and parents of millennials that want to see them in church is rather than sort of if you will, judging them or telling them that how can they not believe what the Bible says, and just kind of beating them over the head of you should have known better, is to love them and is to disciple them, because most millennials have not been in a loving discipleship relationship, and those that have are the ones that are by and large discipling and evangelizing others. And so my encouragement to pastors and parents that are frustrated at millennials is to love them and to show them that love of Christ and to disciple them in the things of the faith rather than complain about the current state of the church.
Yeah, because I'm hearing Grant Skeldon, who's a friend of the program, like, we don't have a millennial problem, we have a discipleship problem, right, in the church. And like, discipleship is that formative relationship that characterizes and also molds individuals. And so I think there's a part of that too, Brent, right? So like at your church in particular, like, so what is your church doing to help individuals to be captivated on the beauty of God that causes even the angels to yearn to hear the message of salvation, and in turn for them to be so captivated by that they go and share with others, but not simply just share it, but also be individuals that have been entrusted with the faithful message to go and trust to others as well? What does that look like at your particular church?
Wow, what a description of what our church looks like there. That's overwhelming. You know, I am a firm believer that we've got to get the Word of God into people.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, that's what it's about. You know, I'm preaching right now all this year on the kingdom of God and trying to help people to understand that the kingdom of God is greater than this current culture and world that we live in, and helping people to understand that this king that we serve and this kingdom that we're a part of is what is to be our passion, our drive, our values. It's to guide our hearts, our families, how we do church, how we live in society. And I'm trying to cast a vision of something greater than self.
Yeah.
Because so much of what the preaching is, and like Michael was talking about, so much of what we do is so self-centered, and how everything is geared around me, and what's in it for me, and how do I apply it. And I understand that, because in years gone by, it used to be that information was passed down from on high and came down to the person in the seat. And now it's the person in the seat who has access to all the information that they want.
Everything.
Right there at their phone, but they don't know how to use it. They don't know how to apply it, and they also don't understand their place in the bigger picture. And so I'm trying to help people to understand that. I'm trying to help people see that on a larger level. But a breakdown in discipleship, like Grant talks about, as we've, as you said, a friend of this program. I mean, Grant is one who I think has got that pulse, because he's right. That is something we've got to get back to. That is a biblical principle that we've got to get back to.
And so, Michael, help me understand this too. Because again, I think it's one thing to identify the problem. I think it's another thing to bring about a solution. And so I'm reminded of this study that came out last week, American Enterprise Institute up in D.C. They had this great 81-page summary, or kind of this study that came out relative to community, kind of the human experience. And one of the things that was one of those aha moments that it was nice to see put numbers on is, one, we've went almost a whole program and haven't mentioned President Trump, which again is pretty record breaking here at this program, as well as just in any everyday conversation. But to go back to the study, it indicated that there are more people that find their sense of community around individuals who share their political ideology more than their theology. And the study specifically said places of worship. And I think that goes back to a comment that Brent was making just earlier about how there's so much information that's inundating us, and the political information is inundating us as well, to the extent that everybody's got an opinion on politics, but as soon as religion comes up, religion is almost the thing that shuts the conversation down. And politics is becoming, to a certain degree, that point as well, of breaking down relationships as well. And so what do you think of those ideas, of the idea of politics becoming this sacred cow that we have now, replacing what for many individuals and for within the human experiment, especially at the Museum of the Bible, what we've seen is the centrality of the biblical narrative, regardless of whether you're going to church or not here in the American experiment?
Yeah, I'm probably I'm definitely in the minority. I mean, I'm currently pursuing my doctorate, and it's a Christian ethics with an emphasis in public policy. It's religion and it's politics combined into one. So I'm going to be really popular at parties, I'm sure, bringing up the two topics no one wants to talk about. So, but I do think you're right, and it just kind of, there's a tendency that we have to withdraw into these echo chambers, to only have these conversations, whether it be about politics or religion, with people that think like us, because it's easy and we can be further indoctrinated in the ways of our thinking. And so then stepping outside of that and developing not just Twitter bashing relationships with people on the other side, but actually genuine friendships is really difficult. It takes hard work. It takes a lot of patience, and it's even awkward sometimes in finding how do you put yourself in those positions, but it's what Christians are called to do. And so I think that both evangelism and discipleship, from a church perspective, and you can call it the millennials perspective, but the reality is, as you've mentioned, like, it's just the modern world, modern skeptical person in America perspective of doing the hard work of developing dinner table relationships where you have the voice to speak into someone's life, ask them really sincere questions to understand where they're coming from, and then offer alternative perspectives. I think it's just difficult, and it's why both for the church to build those relationships with the world outside of the church are important, and what I was saying and what Grant is saying about pastors and parents of millennials, developing that type of relationship with them, creating relational capital, relational investment with them, so that they can lead them to Jesus, lead them to honor Jesus, not just with a decision they made at camp a decade ago, but actually walking with Jesus and allowing his word to shape the way that they think and live today.
Yeah, I think that's one of the glaring needs that we're seeing in society today. There's just a lack of community right now. Numbers indicate that 50% of Americans don't know their neighbors' names, that we have that Boy Scouts attendance is going down, Kiwanis attendance is going down, Rotary Club attendance is going down. There's less places and less individuals that are joining bowling leagues. I guess we could say we're bowling alone. And so there's a desperation for a kind of the camaraderie outside that's, or I would say, thicker than something that's being offered on Facebook or these online. And so what not better way for the church to be commissioned and to go out and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that and a couple of other things when we get back from this break.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. According to the Fresno Bee, the Fresno City Council is considering adding the national motto, "In God We Trust," to the wall of the council chambers. But at least one local resident opposes the proposal. In the mind of one atheist protester, the delicate balance between church and state is upset entirely by the public display of these 4 words. And despite the fact that the atheist writes, quote, "Atheists like me feel the idea of God has little meaning," unquote, he encourages the local community to oppose a word which he believes has little meaning. One wonders how a word with such little meaning can violate the so-called separation of church and state, but that's another issue. Of course, if folks wanted to purchase the article in the Fresno Bee, they would do so with coins bearing the national motto since 1864. The City Council would be in good company with the United States House of Representatives, which has the motto emblazoned behind the Speaker's dais. And on the way to City Hall, residents may have to drive by police or sheriff's cruisers sporting the national motto. Throughout America's history, the national motto has been honored and celebrated as an expression of what it means to be an American. Any effort to prevent its display should be rejected as bald efforts to rewrite our history and destroy our heritage. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. So grateful that you decided to join us on this Wednesday, February 13th, 2019 day, also known as Galentine's Day of all days. So this was popularized in 2010. We've got Parks and Recreation. Leslie Knope of on Parks and Recreation came up with Galentine's Day the day before Valentine's Day to celebrate with your girlfriends. You're wondering where I'm going with this right now. I can hear Michael nervous, wondering where I'm going with my Parks and Recreation illustration, and then Brent just rolling his eyes right now.
Where is he going with this?
Where is he going?
I'm loving it, actually.
But see, like, here's the thing, though. That there's the whole point of Galentine's Day is girls celebrating girls, of just having those individuals that are shaping, that are encouraging us. But one of the things, though, it highlights the need for friendship that we have in today. And Michael, part of your remarks that I think was so point on today is when we were first initiated this conversation about how 47% of church-going millennials would say that sharing the gospel is wrong. They got that from somewhere. There are individuals that are around them that were saying that influenced them. There are sources that were pouring into them that told them, inculcated them in this idea that it is judgmental for them to be able to share the good news of Jesus. Now, nobody else is saying that you can't share some other thing. Like, so I'm going to tell you, you don't go see the Bird Box if you want to be scared, right? Like, that's a really scary, like, I'm sharing news with you right now, much like somebody, but that's not wrong because Netflix is okay for us to be able to share certain things. And so, like, I think you bring up a really great point at the very beginning of this conversation that I want to circle back to, is the idea that we're being shaped by this culture. And it's so interesting how there are certain topics that are off that we can't talk about that's that third rail, right? But there are other topics. We can share. I don't go into examples because I can see Andrew, one of our producers, just saying, dear goodness, Nick, do not give examples because we have no clue where this is going to go. But like you bring up a really great point that I want to circle back to, and I'd love for you to elaborate upon, is this idea that the culture is shaping us in ways that we might want to remain unstained by the world, but we need to recognize that the world is always constantly trying to stain us. And in certain ways, it's inculcating us certain values and characteristics inside of us, even regardless of whether we're part of a church or not.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mentioned, I have a vivid memory in college of sitting in a class discussing the legitimacy of evangelism. And the basic conclusion was similar to what we see in that Barna study, which was that, well, which a lot of non-churched millennials would say, which is, if I want to explore faith, I could do it. Anyone could find faith on their own through Google searches and things like that. So to try and force someone, this idea of proselytizing or by sharing your faith and they would say forcing someone to come to faith is wrong. I asked in class, what if you actually believe in a real place called hell and that there's one way to get there through Jesus? And there was confusion, I remember, in the classroom, and someone said, well, yeah, I guess if I believed that, then evangelism would be fine. And then the conversation of the ethical claims of evangelism just moved on, as if, it was almost dismissed as, that's crazy. People don't actually believe that. But we do. An historically Orthodox Christian view is that very thing. And so I definitely want to, like I said, establish those relationships first, which, again, in that Barna study, you see that the way that people would like to explore faith, and that's among non-Christians in the U.S., the number one way is through casual one-on-one conversation. Number two is through casual conversation with a group. So there's an openness of if I'm a non-Christian, if you're talking to someone that doesn't identify with Christ and they're open to talking about it, the number one way they would want to broach that conversation is in a relationship where it's one-on-one and you're getting to have a conversation with them. But I think that it's really important to sort of seek to understand them first, and then secondly to be understood, that rather than we're not used car salesmen giving a pitch, trying to sell them on a little Jesus, but we're trying to help them see that Jesus is actually He's the joy that they're searching for in all other joys. He's the community that they're searching for in online communities. That comes even within the church and the body of Christ reaching out to them. So that's at least where I would want to start, is helping to engage with them in such a way that they see that what we have to offer is different from the sort of Ned Flanders Christianity, but we have a real thriving relationship with Christ in the church that it might not be what they think it is, but it's more than they ever would have expected or dreamed.
Michael, I don't knock Ned Flanders, by the way, but what you're saying reminds me of the quote. Some of you may remember the Penn Jillette and his quote about proselytizing, and how he said, here's a guy that obviously is not considered to be preaching in any pulpits, but he said, I've always said that I don't respect people who don't proselytize. I don't respect that at all. If you believe that there's a heaven and a hell and people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life, and you think it's really not worth telling them this because it would make it socially awkward, and atheists who think people shouldn't proselytize and who say you should just leave me alone and keep your religion to yourself, how much do you have to hate somebody to not proselytize? How much do you have to hate somebody to believe everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? Well, like I said, Penn Jillette's not coming into pulpits more than likely to preach, but it really is. That's the aspect of it that a lot of people don't see, that you really do. You have to hate somebody not to be willing to tell them. It's not love at all to not make it socially awkward. It is hate to say, hey, I know good news of salvation, but I'm not going to tell you about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I also think there's an aspect of it that maybe that we as pastors can do a better job of in training people towards evangelism, which is that you don't have to take it all the way. And this may be, I may be digging into some theological waters that we all see differently on, so I don't mean to cause controversy, but I would say that when Paul says that, Paul planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth, that even there we see at least a bit of a precedence that if I'm having a conversation with someone that doesn't even believe in God, I'm comfortable with just beginning there. I'm not going to take them all the way to, do you want to repent and accept Christ today? But that each of us to at least have, with the responsibility in evangelism, a responsibility to be open to talking to others about Christ. And it doesn't mean that we have to go, knock on people's doors or, get in car wrecks with people just so that on the side when we're talking about them and waiting for the police report, we can all of a sudden share with them the gospel. But that we need to have an awareness and openness that the Great Commission, again, that as we are going, that we are making disciples, that we're open to sharing our faith. We have such a love for Christ because we understand both what we've been forgiven of and what it cost him to forgive us, that we're sharing that with others in such a way that helps them to see that, hey, this is going to be best for you, not in the sense of it's going to complete the American dream for you, but it's actually far better than the dream that you have for your life right now.
Yeah, I'll disagree with you. I want all the glory. I don't want anybody else to come along and water and grow. I'm the one. No, I'm just kidding. I think you're right on, on that, right? It's the idea, one, as you're going, you contribute your particular part. I always heard this study growing up that 13 people had to share the gospel with an individual before they would come to faith in Christ. I think that's kind of a guesstimate, because at the end of the day, it's only the Lord that's going to cause salvation is from the Lord, and so it's only the Lord that's going to bring that salvation. But it goes back, I think, to again circle the conversation wholly of one, wanting to do everything with excellence, two, wanting to make sure that you're teaching the whole counsel of God, and so maybe. And I know this sounds very contrary to the kind of the zeitgeist of the age, of this reality of you got to light a fire in people by helping them to see. You not sharing is you telling people where they're you're hindering them. You're hindering them from tasting and seeing and knowing that the Lord is good. So all that to say, so grateful that you've decided to join us today. Michael McAfee, we are so grateful. He's got a new book that's coming out here soon, Not What You Think. I'm being told that I need to pub this right now, so you can go to the website at www.pointofview.net, find out more information on this book. Michael, so grateful that you decided to join us. We've got to take a break, but when we come back from the break, we're going to talk a little bit more. We've got Ben Sass and his op-ed that came out over USA Today about infanticide. I think is a fascinating topic, especially relevant to what's happening in the news today. We'll be back right after this.
Here's some great news. If you missed the deadline to sign up for health insurance, or more importantly, if you sign up for a plan that you're just not happy with, you still have a choice. It's called MediShare, and MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing program. It's been around for 25 years. They have more than 400,000 members now around the country. And get this, over the years, MediShare members have shared more than $2 billion of each other's medical bills, so they could help share your needs too. And best of all, you could save a lot of money with MediShare. The typical savings for a family is around $500 a month. Your savings could be more or less, but think about what you could do with that extra money every month. So if you think you're stuck with a high-cost health plan that doesn't have much to offer, think again. You can join MediShare anytime, so call them today and check it out. There's no pressure. They're super easy to talk to. 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome to Point of View on this February 13th, 2019 day. I kept on wanting to say Galentine's Day, but apparently I don't need to say Galentine's Day. So I'll go ahead and say it one more time. Happy Galentine's Day to our listeners. Galentine's Day started in 2010. Leslie Knope of Parks and Recreation came up with this. It's a holiday before Valentine's Day for girls, to celebrate your girlfriends. It's fascinating. Some of the research out there indicates that before the age of 25, men are more quick. Men make friends more quickly than women. After the age of 25, women make friends more quickly than men, and they will actually hold on to those friends. Research indicates that women, if the women have a best friend in the office, they're more productive and they have higher levels of satisfaction in the workplace. Fascinating thing that you just continue to see is this benefit that when women go out with their girlfriends twice a week. And I know what you're thinking to yourself: how does he know all this stuff? This is why you need to subscribe to the Daily Briefing. Now, when women go out with their fellow girlfriends twice a week, they have quicker recovery times from illness, and there's a better life satisfaction rate. And so it's very fascinating, some of this research. And then what do you say? You're probably thinking to yourself, well, I thought there was a bit of Jesus in the midst of this. Well, I'm so glad that you asked, because here's the biblical perspective on this. You've got Naomi had Ruth. You have Martha had Mary. That friends are a rich component of life. C.S. Lewis said that friends have no survival value, but rather they're the things that make up life. They're the things that make you thrive in life. And we all know in the biblical perspective, good friends are there during the worst of times to be able to comfort you, and good friends are there in the best of times to be able to celebrate with you. And I'm so grateful that I have, not a friend. No, I'm just kidding. I've got Brent Taylor, who's a pastor at Church of the Fields, here with me this afternoon. Brent, how are you?
I'm doing well. I saw a thing that somebody put on Twitter not too long ago that said, of all Jesus' miracles, the most remarkable one that's often overlooked is the fact that he was in his 30s and had 12 close friends. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Friendship is something that is lacking in our culture today.
Oh, my goodness.
Sure.
It's so true. Average American 25 years ago had 3.7 friends. That number's dropped down to 1.7 now. 40% of the American populace would say that they're lonely right now, and loneliness is like smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So I guess you would just say that's Sunday afternoon for you. The 15th, no, not really. Just kidding with you. But we're hopefully that you're going to be celebrating Galentine's Day potentially, if that's you. But then remember, men, Valentine's Day is tomorrow as well. And fascinating stat, only 51% of Americans are going to be celebrating Valentine's Day this year. That's down, I think 4 years ago, I think it was in the 60s. It was like 67% that I read earlier today. And so it's just, we're just living in a very interesting world, Brent.
I think I would classify that as the news you're not necessarily going to use category in terms of percentages there, but I think it's a good time to just be reminded of what we ought to be about all the time. Valentine's, of course, reminds us of love, and so we should be about that all the time.
I hear it's more than a feeling.
That's if you want to get into a lyric battle, I'm ready whenever you want to start. So
okay, I can't stop this feeling. Okay, okay. Enough is enough. Let's get to it. So we've got a couple of topics that we're going to be talking about, and then during this hour, we're going to open up the phone lines as well. And so specifically, what we're going to talk about is Senator Ben Sasse, a Republican out of Nebraska, had an op-ed that he penned in the USA Today that was there yesterday, talking about infanticide. We'll be talking a little bit about that during this hour. And then later on during the hour, we're going to revisit the conversation about the Southern Baptist Convention. Over the past 4 days, there was a series of three articles over the past 4 days that were put out that just brought to light some of the atrocities and some of the evil that have been festering in Southern Baptist life. Specifically, over 700 victims have been identified that were subject by over 300 Southern Baptist leaders and volunteers, sexual abuse. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that as well in response to that, as well as what some protocols and some policies that can be put into place to keep that from happening as well. But we'll also be opening up the phone lines. But I want you to know we're going to talk about what I think has been probably a topic of national conversation is this idea of infanticide. And I can't believe we're actually talking about this still, but it's just a fascinating topic, a tragic topic that we're having to talk about that Senator Ben Sasse brought to light, especially in the pages of the USA Today yesterday morning about this infanticide thing. And so, Brent, help us to be able to understand this, because for our listeners, we're probably keenly aware 3 weeks ago, the governor of New York signed a bill that allowed abortions to be able to happen upwards into the third trimester, and then eased some of those abortion restrictions. Then 2 weeks ago, you had a delegate Tran out of Virginia that offered up a bill that would say that really allowed for abortion of even a child that was born that had breached the womb as well. And then Governor Northam, who was embroiled in all this controversy 2 weeks ago, that literally said on radio the child's born, and then the doctors can consult with the mother to decide whether they're going to continue the life of the child. So again, like that quite literally is the epitome of infanticide. And then Senator Ben Sasse offers up this bill on the House or on the Senate floor. It gets rejected from a unanimous consent, and so he pens this just a very gripping but also very persuasive op-ed in the USA Today yesterday. So it's hard to believe that we're talking about this in 2019.
Well, the abortion issue, obviously has been very much in the public view for many, many years, for decades now, and of course pre-Roe versus Wade. But Roe versus Wade is the one that the court case that gets the most attention associated with it. But it's interesting because it seems back in the 80s, 70s, of course, and the 80s especially, lots of talk about abortion and battling abortion, again, inside the Christian community. And we saw that roll over into the 90s as well. And it seems like over the past decade or so, there's almost been a lull in the conversation, and that you just don't hear as many topics, many conversations. I think many people sadly became politically tired of the conversation and felt like there were other issues that needed to be dealt with and needed to be discussed. So there's kind of been a quiet, but over the past few weeks, that storm has come raging again. I think that storm is going to continue to brew. In fact, I think it's going to build to an even greater extent because of President Trump and the Supreme Court placing people like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch onto the bench has caused that there's a lot of concern, and so a lot of action is being taken. And what we have seen over the past few weeks has been deeply disturbing for believers and for people in the pro-life movement, as we have heard comments being made about the life of a child, and even after a child has been delivered, all of a sudden to believe that they no longer have rights until the parents can decide, the mother and the doctor can decide whether or not that child is going to be granted rights. It is the moral degradation of our society on full display, and it is a sad situation.
Yeah, and so we've got to go to a break, but when we come back from the break, we're going to take some of your comments. We're going to explore a little bit more into Senator Ben Sasse's op-ed that he penned in USA Today, but you can call in as well. We'd love to hear your comments on perhaps the article or just the idea of infanticide. That number is 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Nicholas Phillips recently wrote about what he called the sham of American centrism. He tried to explain why former Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz would fail as a presidential candidate. While doing that, he cites a report from the voter study group that helps explain the 2016 presidential election and may even predict the 2020 election. The study plotted a public opinion survey of 2016 electorate along an XY graph. The x-axis represents economic views, the y-axis represents social views. Voters who are social conservatives and economic conservatives are in the upper right-hand quadrant. Voters who are liberal on both social and economic issues are in the lower left quadrant. Howard Schultz, who is a social liberal but a fiscal conservative, would be in the lower right quadrant, where a mere 3.8% of the electorate can be found. Those who voted for Donald Trump were in both the upper left and upper right quadrants. He appealed to both traditional conservatives and populists. By contrast, those who voted for Hillary Clinton cluster mostly in the lower left quadrant. These voters were very liberal both on social issues and economic issues. And I think this illustrates why so many of the announced Democratic presidential candidates are promoting very liberal ideas. Those who voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 are uniformly liberal on social and economic issues, often to the extreme. They will be the ones who will select the next Democratic presidential candidates in 2020. This voter study group graph might actually become quite useful in predicting both the Democratic presidential nominee and even the eventual winner of the 2020 presidential election. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From roadside attractions, Run the Race. Two brothers share an unbreakable bond, but life's unexpected adversities put their future in question. Run the Race, rated PG, in theaters February 22nd.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Pastor Brent Taylor, Dr. Brent Taylor, pastor at Church of the Fields here at a church in Carrollton, Texas. And we have been talking about the infanticide issue, specifically bringing to light that which is unfortunately just been in the national discourse as of late due to some of the bills that are passed in New York specifically, and then also a bill that was entertained within the assembly in Virginia, but was inevitably pulled just because of the backlash that was generated. One, because of a video that went viral almost 3 weeks ago with a Delegate Tran, and then on Wednesday of that week, Governor Northam, in a radio interview, I don't know how or what he was thinking. It was just atrocious because he brought to light that just the logical conclusions of, especially for evangelicals, which you believe to be true. If life begins at conception, you believe it to be true that your abortion is murdering a child. And what Governor Northam did on this radio interview, it was quite literally just entertaining the idea of murdering a child that was outside the womb, as the mother consulted with the doctors as to whether they wanted to keep this child. And it really did shock a lot of the consciences of the American populace, to the extent that Senator Ben Sasse, he's had this bill in the Senate for a while now. He brought it up to a vote earlier last week, and brought it up for a unanimous consent vote. And there was an individual senator that stopped this bill. And so in turn, Senator Sass, this bill did not receive unanimous consent. It was sent back down off the floor. But one of the things that Senator Sass did is that he's penned this op-ed article in USA Today. And so one of the, I want to highlight a particular things that he says, quote, "The days of slogans like safe, legal, and rare are done. Today, an extreme abortion lobby is advocating for abortion any time and for any reason, even after the baby has left the womb." New York, he points out as an example, recently repealed Section 4164 of the public health law, which specified that a child born alive during a botched abortion was protected by the state's laws. Under pressure from the big abortion industry that hands out millions of dollars in campaign donations, some Democrats have become so extreme that they will not take a stand even against outright infanticide. What's changed, Brent? Do you have working theories as to the times when President Clinton, I know that you're a president guy, like you've just got a great mind and a great sense of history relative to presidential history. What's changed from when Bill Clinton was going to offer that line of safe, legal, and rare to today, where you have the Governor Northams of the world, where you have the Governor Cuomo's of the world that are willing to repeal some of these laws that allow for especially infanticide, essentially? What's changed?
Well, that's a great question, and there is so much that has changed, so much in our culture that has changed, and the value of life has changed. We used to be a nation that held high that standard of life, and no longer are we that type of nation. No longer are we valuing those types of important, basic, fundamental principles of who we are as a country. In fact, I've read historians over the years that mock the ancient world, that mock Rome and Greece as being places where human life had no value, and that's how you ended up in, with the Colosseums and the gladiators and seeing the brutality that is there. We've just refined that. We've just become a more modernized version in so many ways. And when we become a country that says that a baby that has been born no longer is protected, does not have that right to live while that baby is there on the table, when we get to that point that we allow that we permit that, and we say that a child can be killed at that point, we have gone to a place that, God help our nation.
Yeah.
And, Senator Sass, basically, I'm not going to quote exactly what he said, but he said, if you can't get behind this type of legislation, you need to get out of office.
Yeah.
And I do not... I think that there are even people who I have people that I know who do not support the pro-life agenda, who were shaken by the issues that were raised with Governor Northam. I think some of that has come out of a panic of what's taken place on the Supreme Court and the fear that Roe versus Wade is going to be overturned. And so I think some of that is pushing the extremes. But this is also just a recognition of our culture and where we've gotten today.
I'm trying to think about what causes this. I know the initial reaction, I think always, especially in my mind, is to be able to point towards technology, right? Technology's dehumanized us. Technology's distanced us from this. But then, you can't help but think, too, also, especially with the pro-choice movement, that idea, like if I'm wanting to think from a pro-choice mentality, preference has always outweighed life, right? Like the idea of I want to be able to choose, I want to be able to make the decision with my body as to what are next steps. Like I understand that, but I also understand the reality of I want you to choose, but I also want to be able to speak up for the child that doesn't get to choose in that particular situation and scenario, simply because you're making the choice for him or her as well. And so I'm trying to think through what have been contributing factors to that? Because I think if you can answer the why question, I think it is really helpful to figure out the how do you move forward from that, and specifically how do you move away from that mentality. And I just can't put my finger on it right now as to why individuals would be so radicalized. And I'm going to say, and I don't want to use this crazy words lightly, become so radicalized to be able to work out a scenario on live radio air to say that a child can be put onto a table after the child has left the mother's womb, and then the doctors to be able to consult as to whether that child can live.
Well, the chilling side of his comments that he made was not just what he said, but how he said it.
Yeah.
He said it in such a what came across to me as very much a calm, cold calculated way, that this is a decision that is not a really important decision. This is something that really is what we value as the freedom of the mother to make that decision, the freedom of the doctor to make that decision, not the freedom of that child who has been born to have life. And that was shocking, I think, to people of all different political persuasions because of the radical nature of that. That was a step that I think got a lot of people's attentions, even people who I mentioned earlier about abortion kind of becoming a tired topic for many people, and they're just tired of talking about it and tired of dealing with it. I think even that rattled cages to where people were saying, okay, that's gone too far. Mm-hmm. That's gone too far. And I think the alarming side of it is people feel like, what has happened to us? Mm-hmm. What has happened to our country? It just feels like the wheels are coming off in a lot of different directions. Yeah. The division within our nation is very deep. And I understand, I do not agree with people who hold a pro-choice position. I do not agree with that position at all. But I understand many of the reasons that they come up with and their perspective. I understand. I can mentally understand that. I cannot wrap my mind around infanticide. Yeah. And I cannot wrap my mind around how our Congress does not view this as a consent item. Yeah. It just seems so obvious.
I think one of the things, like looking at the research, one of the things that to be encouraged by, a couple of things actually to be encouraged by if you're a listener. One, there's the component that public opinion is on our side. Public opinion doesn't change the truth, but in this particular instance, public opinion does amplify the truth, which is the reality that the majority of people believe it to be true that third-term abortions are wrong, that there shouldn't be third-term abortions. Among millennials, the majority of millennials are pro-life in instance, and so the majority of millennials, and so those are things to be able to celebrate for. Another thing to be able to celebrate is the fact that over the past 4 years, the number of abortions have continued to go down. That's something that we can greatly rejoice in. That right now, its numbers vary anywhere from a little above 600,000 abortions that are performed every year. That's a pretty steep drop from where it has been over the years, but still murder. And so it's still shocking, that piece. And a reason why it's gone down is because of some of these state laws. And I think that's the thing that really hits me, is that there's been so much legwork that's been done in state houses across the country that has really tamped down those abortion numbers. And so when you start to see some of these outposts in Virginia, of all places, which is a purple state, it swings back and forth. New York's a blue state, but still, for them to be able to pull back some of those, it's pretty shocking. It's pretty shocking.
I think it's caused people to step back and to examine. And I think we as a nation, I think we've got to return to prayer on this matter. Yeah. I think churches have got to be praying about it. I think pastors need not be afraid of speaking out on these matters, because it is a level of radicalism, like you've talked about, that is taking us to a new place that I don't think that we want to go to as a country.
And that's one of the, I want to hit on that point, and then we've got to go to a break, is the reality is that abortion isn't just a them issue. It's an us issue, especially for the Christian, that anywhere from 40 to 50% of the abortions that are performed on women that are Christian, that self-identify as Christian, which is a shocking number. So we've got to take a break right now. But when we come back from the break, we're going to continue talking about this, and I'm going to pick Brent's brain as to what are some next steps that we can take in order to try to see the squelching of the abortion issue. We'll be back right after this.
Question: do you have a health insurance plan you are not happy with? Well, Bethany and Jason thought they were stuck. Their plan just kept getting more expensive, and Bethany's favorite doctor didn't even take that plan anymore. And then some friends at church told them about MediShare.
With our previous insurance, we were paying $1,200 a month. With MediShare, we now pay around $600 a month.
Yes, they're paying $600 less per month, and that's a pretty typical savings with MediShare. And they actually like MediShare more.
I was able to go back to my original doctor that I absolutely loved, and it's just been an absolutely beautiful thing being a part of MediShare.
Yeah, so they pay a lot less, and they like it more. No wonder MediShare is growing so fast. Find out more. They're super easy to talk to. All you have to do is call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts, and I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Brent Taylor. So grateful that you've decided to join us. We've been talking about the infanticide issue, specifically an article, of op-ed came out recently, just actually yesterday. Senator Ben Sasse penned a great op-ed talking about just calling us to our, to a certain degree, I know, Brent, you're a presidential historian, calling out our better angels, really, of just this idea of we're better than this. To be able to contemplate these laws about individuals that are largely these children that are born, and the idea that we would even consider not giving our fullest so that they might be able to pursue after their happiness. It's just unbecoming of particular of us as Americans and that American spirit that we have. And so you can find that op-ed on our website at www.pointofview.net, as well as you can call in. I'm really interested in the why question. Why now? Why do we continue to hear more about infanticide? I'm just shocked. Why are we starting to see the repeal of some of these abortion laws at the state level that have been that I would contend are a large rationale, a large reason why we're seeing so much success, why we've seen so much success relative to the number of abortions have continued to decline over the years. You can call in. I'd love to hear your comments on what's happening right now. You can call in at 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. I also want to accentuate Facebook as well. You can put a little question or comment on the Facebook page at www.facebook.com/pointofviewradio. Leave your question or comment online, and we'll get to it over air as well. And so we're going to jump on the phones right now. So we've got Kathy in California right now. Kathy, are you there?
Yes. The thing is we've had infanticide because you had Killer the Killer. You also had Gosnell, and then there was the baby body parts in experiment. But here's the thing. When do others get to make the decision when human life ends? Because in, I believe it's Denmark, a child can decide to end their life at 9 years old. But then you have to ask the question, who will be making the decisions for the elderly, for those that are mentally handicapped? Because that really gets into the fantasize of what age and who. Because in some countries where they have health care, they make decisions at the end of life, and you can be as young as very young in age, and they decide, well, you're not going to get care, or your family. Because you had two babies that were born over, one in France and I think England, they were denied the opportunity to come to America to have surgery that would have possibly made them grow up to be adults.
Yeah.
And yet doctors made decisions, no, they can't come because it's too expensive, one. Two, you can't guarantee that child's going to have a good quality of life, because once you give birth, they can deny any kind of medical attention, not only to a baby, but to an adult.
Yeah. Kathy, I think you're bringing up some great points that are kind of illuminated in the headlines today. I'm reminded of a story that was put out by CBS News that talked about how Iceland was boasting of the fact that they're almost a place where there are no children with Down syndrome. But what they're saying isn't medical advances to be able to cure babies of Down syndrome. What they're saying is they're aborting babies that show signs of having Down syndrome, which is just a radically different response to this. And then we're starting to see even laws that are popping up here in the U.S. right now, the physician-assisted suicide at the end of life. That's happening. It started, I believe it was one of the first states. I'll say one of the first states was in Oregon. And then it's popping up all over the country right now. And so, Brandon, it's like we're devaluing life right now. And I understand the side of wanting to alleviate suffering. I just think there's got to be other ways to be able to alleviate that suffering without eliminating that life.
Well, if you start from the foundation that the person, the individual, is the center of all, and so they make their decisions based off of what is best for them, then it's going to lead to a culture that says, okay, if this person's life is not deemed worthy, then we will end that life, or that individual will choose to end that life. That's very different than beginning from a basis that says, okay, God is the author and creator of life, and he is the one that is in control of our lives. And so when you operate from that basis, then you take a totally different view on the culture of life. And the culture of life is not just about the abortion issue. It's not just about euthanasia issue at the end of life. It's a culture of life all the way through that we as believers value. We value the human life, and we value what God has created. And so what perspective you begin from will inform your decisions. And yes, we've seen where our culture, where our country used to value life a lot more than what it does today. Yeah. And now we're seeing what we've seen in the ancient world, where lives are simply thrown away that are not deemed useful.
Yeah, that's you're bringing up great points. And so let's keep on going to the phone lines. We've got Mike in South Carolina right now. Mike, you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Hey, Mike, what's your point of view?
My point of view would be if we go back and kind of look at the root cause of it, we can see Roe versus Wade I think it was just by one decision. Baby, abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at it from the spiritual point of view, we look at the easy divorce laws. Now we look at homosexual marriage, and I actually don't know what marriages they allow now. Do they allow you can marry yourself and all that now, or is it just homosexual marriage and marriage between a man and a woman? Do you know the laws now?
Yeah, they vary. They vary based on states' rights right now.
Yeah, and then when we see gender neutral, which really parents is abusing their own children by not, what they were born, boy or girl, that's abusive too. That's very destructive to the child. Mm-hmm. So, we can see a lot of root causes, and from a spiritual perspective also, how we've fallen. I know you had asked the question, how have we gotten where we've gotten? Would you agree with it?
Yeah, I think you're on the right track, Mike. I can definitely agree with that. I think I'm reminded of Churchill. Churchill says that the further we look back into the past, the more clearly we can see into the future. And I think that's one of the reasons why I always want to ask the why question. I always want to get to the bottom of it, is because I think when we can look back to the past and we can try to identify some of those ingredients and factors that led to this decision and this predicament that we find ourselves in now, it helps us to be able to move forward in the future. And in particular, in this instance, it helps us to be able to figure out how can we pivot from what appears to be starting to be gestures of moving towards trying to provide more abortions to how do we pivot away from that and move towards how can we completely eliminate abortions. And, Brent, there's and push back on me if you will, if you want, there's a sense that I don't know if we'll ever get to a point where we can completely outlaw abortion. But I do know that there's a charge and there's the capacity within the church to make abortion unthinkable. Like we have the resources. I think about 72% of women that get an abortion feel pressured. They're one of the key phrases that they always go back to, according to the research, is they're trying to manage an array of responsibilities. And what would it look like for the church to alleviate some of that pressure? So in the present, so that they could dream about a future with the child. I think the church has a great capacity in that particular space to be able to help alleviate some of that present burden in order that the child could be born and thrive into the future.
Well, the church has great opportunity, and there are different ways that churches can be involved in supporting on a very local level of supporting, different types of groups, pregnancy centers that are within your organization. I'm going to back up because I want to say, first of all, I think this must be a matter of prayer. I keep saying that, but I just can't emphasize that enough. I think this has got to be a matter of prayer, and I think it's something that that churches and believers who make up those bodies, they embrace the value of life and they embrace the culture of life. I think a lot of people are reluctant to speak out on that. And I've got some more thoughts we can talk about on that after the break.
Yeah, and so we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. But right now we got to go to a break. So you can call in 800-351-1212, 800-351-1212. We're going to take a short break, but then when we come back, we're going to offer more thoughts on this infanticide issue as it comes up, as well as just how can we begin to pivot away from a position where we're trying to provide more abortions to more of a gesture whereby we can see less abortions performed. But we'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. According to the Fresno Bee, the Fresno City Council is considering adding the national motto, "In God We Trust," to the wall of the council chambers. But at least one local resident opposes the proposal. In the mind of one atheist protester, the delicate balance between church and state is upset entirely by the public display of these four words. And despite the fact that the atheist writes, quote, "Atheists like me feel the idea of God has little meaning," unquote, he encourages the local community to oppose a word which he believes has little meaning. One wonders how a word with such little meaning can violate the so-called separation of church and state, but that's another issue. Of course, if folks wanted to purchase the article in the Fresno Bee, they would do so with coins bearing the national motto since 1864. The City Council would be in good company with the United States House of Representatives, which has the motto emblazoned behind the Speaker's dais. And on the way to City Hall, residents may have to drive by police or sheriff's cruisers sporting the national motto. Throughout America's history, the national motto has been honored and celebrated as an expression of what it means to be an American. Any effort to prevent its display should be rejected as bald efforts to rewrite our history and destroy our heritage. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. We are so grateful that you decided to join us for this last segment. If you've been paying attention for 3 hours, we are going to send you something. So,
a new car.
I don't know if I can back that up, but I feel good about it. So we've been talking a little bit about the abortion issue, specifically infanticide, how it seems to become more prevalent just as the days continue on. And so we've been taking some of your questions or comments, and so we're going to continue doing that. And so we've got, we got Michelle in Arizona right now. Michelle, are you there?
I am here, yes.
Hey, Michelle, what's your point of view?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I just had a comment about the possibility of the baby being born. And I was wondering, well, why is the baby being born to just be put to death? Or born, I'm supposing, stillborn, and they would resuscitate the baby and put the baby to death.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought about it, and what's to prevent them from placing the child at a very young age into sex trafficking,
mm-hmm.
or the baby being murdered and used for parts for, something else,
mm-hmm.
or used, basically as a lab rat. And so, what's to prevent that? If those laws were to put into place, what's to prevent that? And that's just what I was thinking, and that's, that was my point of view.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a great point, because the extent of a mother can carry a child, the child can be born. And so some of these laws, specifically what's happening in New York, but also
mm-hmm.
what was potentially happening in Virginia is really just the easing of those laws for the third trimester abortions. And now we know that to be just awful, just because we know the child is just developing, and you're starting to see these characteristics and qualities that sometimes can be more difficult to be able to see at the 3-week, at the 4-week, at the 5-week level. But one of the things that I do want to, because I'm a stats guy, and one of the things I do want to point out, that they estimate around 1% of abortions happen between that 21 plus weeks is how they categorize it. So there's very few abortions that happen at that age. But like you bring up a really great point when you're listing off those examples. There are so many parents out there, and so many future parents out there that are so desiring of adoption right now, that there's just such a beautiful opportunity in this, that a mother is considering aborting their child, but ends up having this child. And the idea that that's what was so shocking to me with Governor Northam, the idea that you would consider killing this child, consulting with the doctors literally while this child is being cleaned up and resuscitated, when there are hundreds of thousands of parents on the list to adopt domestically. It shocks me, one, and two, it saddens me, just because there's a solution there, and the solution doesn't necessarily have to be ending that child. And I know any parent, regardless of whether it's legally recognized or not, would be willing to jump leaps and bounds to be able to care for that child as it waits there. I think that was one of the things that was illuminated for me. And
I also just point out to the listener too that if you read the article, if our listeners will read the article, that the op-ed piece that Ben Sass is referring to, he's referring specifically to botched abortions.
Yeah.
So abortions that are basically malpractice because the baby lives.
Yeah.
And then determining after the baby has been born and is alive, then determining whether or not the baby's life will then be taken after it's out of the womb.
Yeah.
And it's disgusting.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just, and the fact that our United States Senate, the most august body in the history of the world, as has been said, could not come to a unanimous consent on that. It's shocking, to say the least. And so let's jump on over. Michelle from Arizona, thank you so much for your phone call. Let's jump over to Dennis in South Carolina right now. Dennis, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, Dennis, what's your point of view?
Well, thank you for taking my call. I'm 70 years old. I grew up in a time when abortion was unthinkable.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the day, I remember where I was and what I was doing the day that I heard that Roe was approved, and it shocked me. I was stunned. I felt like, what is going on? Something's wrong. We're not barbarians. We're Americans. It was just an unbelievable thing. And what's happened, you try to trace it back, it goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, but to try to reason with the people who believe that this is okay is, I think, a Christian trying to reason with a humanist. We're trying to talk their language to them, and we can't do that. That's not going to help. We have to talk our language to them, not their language to them.
Mm-hmm.
They have to hear the truth. They have to hear what a Christian believes. They have to hear what sanctity of life really sounds like. They can't hear, oh well, it's a viable baby, or we can hear the heartbeat, or the life begins at conception. They need to hear that baby was knit together. By God.
Yeah. Yeah, Dennis, I completely agree with you. I think that's one of the things that I'm always just so pressed on is I don't want to simply just to be able to communicate what I believe is happening, but how can I infuse the divine language in that? But then how do I say something that gets the other side to be able to catch it as well? And I think that's one of the beautiful things, especially for the Christian perspective, that we feel the weight of it just because there's a life in the midst of it that's hanging on the balance because of it. But also the second point is that we have the creator God on our side, who is a very creative God, and a creative God that has, when he spoke, things happened. And he's given us certain powers and capacities as well, Brent, that allows us to be able to speak into those situations and not necessarily to condemn individuals, but to point individuals towards the greater reality of the decisions that they face in that particular moment.
Yeah, and let me just say a word of encouragement to pastors out there. A lot of times pastors are afraid to speak out on the issue of abortion because they're afraid it's going to get political, and people come to church hopefully to escape the political morass that we deal with. And but I think that this is I think a pastor can speak without it being political. Yeah. I think a pastor can speak about the culture of life and the value of life that we find in Scripture. A lot of times pastors feel like that it's going to drive women away who have had abortions, and yet I think so many women that I've encountered, even in my own church, that have walked through that path are trying to find answers and trying to find compassion and love and grace, and I think that's a great opportunity for pastors to show that even in the midst of what's happening. At times they feel inadequate to speak out, pastors do, and so I just encourage pastors to become aware, become informed. There's a website, the Vox Project, voxproject.org, that has a lot of information on its website that might be helpful to pastors out there. But I'd also just say, too, whether you're a pastor or whether you're just a parishioner, somebody just listening today, hey, one of the great things we have in this country is the ability to go and vote. Mm-hmm. So sign up, get out, and vote, because elections make differences. That is the truth. And so elections make differences, and I like to think this radio show makes a difference as well. Not so much when Brent's here, but especially... No, I'm just kidding. Brent. Let me know how Galentine's goes for you. Well, Brent Taylor, thank you so much for joining us today. And for our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We are grateful, to say the least. And so we will be back here tomorrow. And until then, hope you have a great day.
Roadside Attractions presents Run the Race. Two brothers share an unbreakable bond, but life's unexpected adversities put their future in question.
It's all part of his plan, right?
God does love you. He loves you like crazy.
From executive producers Tim Tebow and Robbie Tebow, Run the Race. Rated PG, parental guidance suggested. In theaters February 22nd. More information is available at runtheracemovie.com.
Jesus said you could find a person's heart by where they invest their money. We at Point of View could not be more thankful that so many demonstrate a love for truth and for this nation by investing in our common mission. Of course, the reality is our team, our truth team, is a small percentage of those who listen. And right now, as they say in sports, we could use a deeper bench. For those who have given, thank you. And if you haven't made that step yet, take one now. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Show your heart for our future. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.